Uyghur population has more than doubled in the last 4 decades. So how can people talk about so-called genocide?
The Chinese government pushes back against critical Western reporting on Xinjiang. We will take a closer look. Hello, I'm Ahmed, and this is The Heat. Western countries impose sanctions on China in response to allegations of human rights abuses in its Xinjiang Uygur Autonomous Region. Those allegations, reported by Western media outlets, claim the minority Uyghur Muslim population is being subjected to forced labor and other abuses. CGTN's Huang went to Xinjiang and filed this report.
Dilanir Bakhtiar is the eldest daughter of her family. Her father became disabled after a traffic accident, and her mother left them after getting a divorce. Her 2 younger sisters, one still at school and the other who's just started work, are unable to support the family. Despite all the hardships, she managed to finish college and now is the only Uyghur among the 10 accountants in a cotton textile factory thanks to her education.
I came to the factory in 2017. At first, my salary was not very high, and I used to send half of it to my father back home. Gradually, as my salary increased, I could pay off my loans and have some savings.
Dilanir's colleague, Patty Gore-Torsen, is the only person in her family who has a job. Her mother-in-law has been bedridden with severe diabetes for years, and her husband has to stay home to take care of her. Her 2 teenage daughters are both in boarding school, which makes life easier for her. After years of hard work, she's now the head of the workshop in the factory, and in 2016, she was named a national model worker in the textile industry.
In 2016, I trained the new employees. I taught them how to use the machine safely. I did very well at work, so I got the award. And I went to Beijing to receive it. It was the first time I had ever traveled by plane and also my first time in Beijing. I'm really grateful because if I didn't have this job, I might have never had the chance to travel to Beijing.
Abla Mamaiti had only about 60 square meters of cotton field in his hometown, and the annual income from growing cotton couldn't support his family of 7. So he came to Aksu looking for a better job. Now Abla has a 4-year-old daughter, and he's just bought a house in downtown Aksu with monthly mortgage repayment of 1,600 yuan, or around $240.
I met my wife a year after I came to the factory. We both work here and we can earn over 10,000 yuan per month. If I hadn't taken the job, my life would be much harder. In my hometown, people's quality of life is much worse.
These are just 3 of the thousands of Uyghur employees at a cotton textile company in Aksu, southern Xinjiang, devoting themselves assiduously to working for a better life. But these diligent and motivated workers have been described in Western propaganda as forced labor, and the company that employs them was among the entities sanctioned by the U.S. last May over what Washington says are human rights issues. The firm has consistently requested that its name not be used as it wants to avoid any more negative repercussions amid the recent Xinjiang cotton ban.
A senior executive said the company suffered significant losses after the sanctions last year. But still, management insisted factory operation continue as over 5,000 local people, 90% of whom are Uyghurs, rely on the factory for work.
As the largest yarn maker in the textile hub of Aksu, the company is a key local employer, helping over 2,600 people shake off poverty since it was founded in 2010. The products of the company used to be exported to the U.S. and European countries, but now they've been redirected to the domestic market. But even during the most difficult times following the sanctions, the workers say their managers made sure there were no cuts in their wages or bonuses. Huang, CGTN, Aksu, Xinjiang Uygur Autonomous Region.
Well, to discuss the situation in Xinjiang, let's bring in our panel. From Beijing, Zoon Ahmed is a visiting fellow at Tsinghua University. From Bangkok via Skype, Pepe Escobar is the editor-at-large for the Asia Times. Here in Washington, D.C., also via Skype, Cohen is a correspondent for Behind the Headlines. And with me here in the studio, CGTN correspondent Peng, who has reported from Xinjiang. Welcome to all of you. Zoon Ahmed, let me start with you. There are now sanctions being imposed by some Western companies in China. We look at brands like H&M, Nike as well, a very big sports equipment company. They've chosen not to buy cotton which is produced in the Xinjiang region. What impact are these sanctions having, and how are they being seen in China?
Okay, Anand, firstly, thank you for having me on the program. The question of Xinjiang is something that in recent months especially has gained a lot of heat, not only in Western countries, but now even in China, people are discussing what is the real issue, what is the evidence on which these certain countries that are forming a coalition against China vis-a-vis Xinjiang, what evidence are they basing these accusations on? So obviously, when you see a track record of the US in particular to justify intervention, sanctions on various countries, we see that this is not something new. It's a script that we're familiar with. Secondly, there is motive. It's been a while since the US has made their intention very clear that they will, by any means possible, try to contain China's rise, try to incentivize countries to push against China or to reduce their links with China. So in all of this context, when this kind of coverage enters the Chinese media and they see what's being said, the reaction is obviously that they feel perturbed. They understand that there is a motive to target them. So at large, Chinese people, we've seen a reaction that they are themselves as well boycotting these brands that have politicized the question without enough evidence, have discriminated against Xinjiang cotton. And this is something that we will see moving forward, that people will continue to support their government. Now, when we talk about people in Xinjiang who are being affected directly, Xinjiang is in fact an example for countries, for the region at large, that have faced the kind of issues that Xinjiang was experiencing. They've come a long way. Economic growth has been phenomenal in recent years, and the Uyghur people in particular have benefited from this. Now, what is the impact of sanctions? It's regular people that are trying to make a living, trying to make ends, and that have in Xinjiang benefited from the recent stabilization of the security situation. They are the ones being impacted at first. We've seen that sanctions have had a negative impact anywhere else in the world, and especially when it comes to China, of course, you can't contain a country that big, that is the biggest trading partner for most countries in the world. So I think the reaction from the people is definitely they're not supportive. They feel attacked. In China at large, and as far as Uyghur people are concerned, obviously they will be affected. But I will end with this, that I think China is diversifying. There is a world outside. Within China, there's a great market. There are many countries apart from these that are boycotting. And I think in the near future, perhaps diversification of Xinjiang cotton, exporting Xinjiang cotton could be the way forward.
Peng, there's another popular United States brand, Skechers. We see them in department malls all over the place. They released a statement that reads, Skechers also confirmed that it conducted multiple audits, both announced and unannounced, and that none of these audits revealed any indications of the use of forced labor or other concerns on labor conditions. That's from Skechers. But now when it comes to companies like Nike and H&M, do you know how they have got their evidence or the facts on what they base their decisions?
I would say, of course, they didn't do any of the audits independently in Xinjiang, because if they've done their audits when they are going so strong in boycotting the Xinjiang cotton, they should at least provide some of the hard evidence to show to the world that Xinjiang does have forced labor or some other, crime against humanity, right? But what's going on is that we have seen that either these companies or the Western media, they're just using the third or fourth hand information as evidence, or they're just interviewing those one-sided exiles people who are just having one-sided part of the voices instead of having the other side of the voice in having coverage. So my understanding as a journalist is that when you are doing coverage like this, you should have both sides of the sources. And most importantly, go to Xinjiang and check out. In Xinjiang, the access for reporters are fully open. All you need to do is to inform the government that you're going there as a foreign journalist, and most importantly, get permissions to enter people's homes and also get permissions to interview people.
So very quickly, companies, these are big corporations, Nike and H&M, so they're depending on what, media reports?
They're just depending on reports like this, which are just busy seeking for justifications in Xinjiang by not providing facts, but providing just a narrative or providing justifications that fits into the narrative that they want to provide.
Right. Pepe, Escobar, we have seen Western pressure against China increase over the past few years. In fact, President Biden came into office and kept most of the Trump measures against China untouched. And we've heard many reasons on why the United States is doing this. I mean, we heard some from Zoon, Ahmed, Cohen a moment ago. But I want to play you an excerpt of a speech that Lawrence Wilkerson, he was the chief of staff to the former Secretary of State Colin Powell. He made this speech some time ago, but he talked about some of the reasons why pressure is being put on China. Let's listen to it.
There are 20 million Uyghurs, and they don't like Han Chinese in Xinjiang province in western China. Well, the CIA would want to destabilize China, and that would be the best way to do it, to foment unrest and to join with those Uyghurs in pushing the Han Chinese and Beijing from internal places rather than external. Not saying it's going on right now. You didn't hear that.
So what do you make of that, Pepe? What do you think the motivation is?
Well, it's absolutely correct. Colonel Wilkerson is part of our circle. We're always in touch. What he says about the CIA operation is absolutely correct. In fact, the destabilization of Xinjiang from the outside is a CIA black ops. It's a direct counterpart to what they tried with the Hong Kong Color Revolution, which I covered in detail in a few trips to Hong Kong, which was my former home before I moved to Bangkok. The thing is, we have to look at this strategically. It's very important. Colonel Wilkerson gives us a few hints. This is part of a broader CIA hybrid war strategy to try to destabilize China, especially now investing in the key border between China and Central Asia, which means trying to pierce a sort of, a Trojan horse inside Xinjiang, because Xinjiang is the absolutely key connection of the Belt and Road between China, Western China, Central Asia, and further on to Western Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. So what they try in Hong Kong, color revolutions will never work in Xinjiang. So if you demonize industry in Xinjiang, which is the case of the highly mechanized cotton industry in Xinjiang, and you create the perception for Western audiences, American but also Europeans, which copy these rules that emanate from the Beltway, from the CIA especially, you create a global perception that China is, and then we hark back to the very dangerous World War II era terminology of concentration camps, forced labor, and all that. So you create the perception in Western audiences that what China is doing is equivalent to what the Nazis did before and during World War II. This is extremely dangerous. It works for misinformed people across the West, but it does not work in the main audience in the world, which is the global South.
Right. Dan Cohen, you've done a lot of reporting on this issue. Let's listen to what President Biden said recently about this. He was talking at the news conference that he held just a few days ago. Let's watch.
China has an overall goal, and I don't criticize them for the goal, but they have an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch.
So, Dan, you know, we often hear the United States talk about the rules-based order in the world. And it seems here, when you listen to President Biden, that he's saying that, look, China is violating that rules-based order. Can't understand why. You know, it would be a violation if a country wants to grow economically, if it wants to be prosperous, if it wants its people to have a better life. So is this really about containing China?
I think it absolutely is about containing China. I mean, when President Biden and American politicians, as Secretary of State Tony Blinken spoke about in Anchorage to his Chinese counterparts, when they speak about the rules-based order, this is a euphemism for American imperialism, that everyone around the world, all countries are subjects of the American empire, and they have to follow the orders of the U.S. Now, this rules-based order is selectively enforced. For example, the crimes of the United States are perfectly allowed. The destruction of Iraq, the destruction of Syria, Afghanistan, all over the region, the crimes in Yemen, Israeli apartheid is sponsored, yet we see that the U.S. also, in addition to creating human rights abuses, it also projects these human rights abuses onto other countries like China. And so we are now subject to a massive propaganda campaign because the U.S. clearly understands that Xinjiang is the gateway to not only Central Asia, which is the central region to basically be able to influence the world, but also into Europe and the Middle East and to Africa. And so for the U.S., I think this is a last desperate struggle to maintain global hegemony and try to stop the seemingly inevitable rise of China as a global power that's presenting an alternative to Western imperialism and much more of a fair trade, where both, it's not a zero-sum game as the U.S. sees it, but where both trading partners benefit, and that's what the U.S. is so afraid of.
Zoon, we have seen some response from China, and we know the companies that I mentioned right at the beginning of the show, companies like H&M and Nike. Nike has lost some of its promotional contracts in China with Chinese celebrities. H&M has been taken off some of the e-commerce platforms in China as well. What can you tell us about this kind of pressure that China is responding with?
For China and for Chinese people, it's a pretty, I think it's a legitimate response. It's in kind. If a company is getting involved in politics, as all of your panelists also agree, baseless ideas and trying to become a part of this broader scheme to channel their negativity towards China or to become part of this entire plot, then of course I think the Chinese have the right and perhaps even the responsibility to respond in kind. And perhaps this is something which here I believe that China is not just speaking for itself, but a lot of countries that were not able to have this kind of an impact and were treated unjustly, many countries in the global south, many countries that have just been mentioned by the panel, they don't have that kind of leverage because China, a country of almost 1.5 billion, can retaliate, can respond, and it's an appropriate response, especially given that they are clearly being targeted. So I think obviously people here feel very strongly about these kind of accusations. China is not a country that tolerates diversity, but celebrates it. And for an ignorant Western audience, the kind of images and the kind of ideas that are being portrayed are extremely misleading. This kind of weaponization of empathy is not being done for the first time, and the polarization that's resulting from it can, I think, hurt the United States as well, these companies that are coming in the way as well. Yeah. But they will definitely not hurt China more than they hurt them in the long term. And it seems to be a desperate attempt. One more thing I would like to point out, that a lot of the rhetoric we see now, a lot of the policy we see now is very similar to the kind of strategy that was assumed during the Cold War. And it's been ongoing ever since. Yeah. So I feel at that time, back then, Western European countries at some point said they want the Russians and the Americans to de-escalate. And I do feel that members of the Quad, for example, countries like India and Japan, for example, even Australia to some extent, and East Asian countries, at some point will see that their idea, their interests do not align so much with the Biden administration.
Okay, Peng, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Xu Tiankai, he was on CNN last week. He was interviewed there. This is some of what he had to say. Let's watch.
What we did was not to start a war there. We did not use missiles or drones. We set up efforts for education and training, help people to learn more about the law, to acquire good skills, to improve their lives, find good jobs. And all this has made a huge difference. There has been no single terrorist attack in the last few years.
Now, you have been to Xinjiang, you reported from there. What can you tell us about the terrorist threat there and how it's being countered?
Well, actually, if you look at it, The way that Xinjiang and the United States are fighting the terrorism are absolutely different. The way that Xinjiang fights terrorism is just to find the root cause. The root cause is very simple: poverty. The poor people who are desperate are more likely to launch attacks. Either it's terrorist attack or just the criminal attacks to ordinary people, right? So what Xinjiang did is just to uproot that breeding ground of terrorism by eliminating poverty. By the end of 2020, Xinjiang had 0 population under the line of absolute poverty, just like the entire China. And also, the other thing that Xinjiang is fighting is just to fight the infiltration of extremist ideas, because there are just these people propagating these jihadist ideas, saying that if you kill the so-called infidels, you can go to the heaven and enjoy the 72 virgins, right? All these crazy ideas. And then Xinjiang just tell them the true version of Quran, telling them Islam is a peaceful religion and Muslims should never kill. So these are just Xinjiang's way of fighting terrorism, doing it within its own territory and finding the root cause. Yeah. The way the United States is fighting terrorism is absolutely different. Under the Bush administration, after the 9/11 attack, what they did is to go on with these preemptive strikes by overthrowing other governments and setting up the so-called American-style democracy, and believing that the American-style democracy can defeat the ideology of hatred in the Middle East. So what we have seen after that, after 20 years of war in the Middle East, is that terrorism is on the rise. The way that they fight is different, and the result they achieved is also very different. This is not about whataboutism. This is about, when the United States is having such a bad record in fighting terrorism and protecting human rights, why does it have the qualification to be a teacher and tell what Xinjiang what to do? Yeah,
Pepe Escobar, the United States is expressing a great deal of concern about the plight of Muslims in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. And I'm wondering to what extent, we've just been listening to what has happened in other parts of the world. To what extent is this United States concern undercut by the fact that it seems to have a lack of concern for people in Syria or in Libya, for that matter?
That's a very good question, because, look, I've been following this thing for over 2 years, even before 9/11. I followed everything that happened in what the Americans call the Greater Middle East, which is from Northern Africa, Western Northern Africa, to Afghanistan and everything in between, for over 20 years, including all the wars, including, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the proxy war in Syria, the war in Libya, etc. Just to give an example, what I saw in Mali before 9/11 is exactly what was replicated in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs 10 years later, or 15 years later. These people were being radicalized online by Saudi or Kuwaiti ultra absolute conservative and extreme right-wing Wahhabi preachers, Salafi jihadis, in fact, online, and then they will go on a jihadi against the infidels. And in Uyghurs, and in Xinjiang with Uyghurs is the same thing. I talked to Uyghurs in Massoud's prisons in the Panjshir Valley 2 weeks before 9/11, just to give an idea. Through an interpreter, I knew how these Uyghurs were indoctrinated, and they were all indoctrinated online. And this is a process that went on and on and on for the past 2 decades. So what the Chinese government is doing with these radicalized elements in Xinjiang is I would say it's an even softer version of what the Russians did with the Chechens, Dagestanis, and Uyghur Chechens that were radicalized in the underbelly of the former Soviet Union. And they were going back to the Russian Federation to wreak havoc. And the Chinese government knows that these Uyghurs who are in Idlib in Syria now, they may come back to Xinjiang and wreak havoc in Xinjiang and against Beijing.
Okay. Dan Cohen, you wrote that many of the accusations against the Chinese authorities have come from the same source, research by a man called Adrian Zenz. What can you tell us about Zenz?
Well, Adrian Zenz is a German evangelical Christian fundamentalist whose first book was about what he believes will happen in the end times, and an apocalyptic end times prophecy. And so in that book, he writes against gender equality. He writes about how Jews like myself will burn in a fiery furnace which is, pretty disturbing to hear this, particularly from a German. And now he has transitioned into, in the past few years, he has transitioned into a pseudo-expert on a supposed expert on Uyghurs and Xinjiang province, and China at large. And we've reviewed his claims, and his so-called research doesn't hold up to the slightest amount of scrutiny. He has faked numerous numbers. His work is published by the Jamestown Foundation, which is a neoconservative think tank here in Washington, D.C. that has 2 former CIA directors, I believe, on its staff. It was founded in the 80s with the blessing of the CIA director at the time. And now Adrian Zenz, his lies have been the basis. Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, directly referred to Adrian Zenz in a statement announcing that the U.S. is designating China guilty of genocide. So Adrian Zenz is the key figure that has been propagating these lies, and we have to wonder why not only Zenz is able to do this, but why does Western media, and not only right-wing media that maybe you would expect it from, but progressive outlets, that opposed, for example, the war in Iraq, why are these outlets taking Zenz seriously and they don't examine his claims? They just take it at face value. So it's really speaks to the level of propaganda that we're seeing, that it's one serial fabulist, outright liar who is being paraded around as an expert without, being a documented liar. That is Adrian Zenz.
Right, Zoon, I don't have too much time left, but I do have one final question for you, and that is, there have been calls for a boycott of the Winter Olympics, which is scheduled to take place in China next year. How is China responding to that?
I think, Anand, obviously, any country that's hosting the Olympics is doing that in a spirit of goodwill. And for Beijing, this is going to be the second opportunity after 2008. Calls to boycott the Olympics have been refuted within countries that are where they have these voices that are active. For China, obviously, they are going to cooperate fully with any authorities, with the Olympics Council as well, to make sure that such actions are not materialized. And I think China is not on the back foot, to be very honest. They are quite confident about their position, about their contributions to the global community at large. And obviously, I hope that it doesn't materialize. But I do have a quick comment, which has not to do with the Olympics.
Yeah.
It has to do with radicalization and the SCO. And I'll just quickly want to say that let's look at other countries in the region that have faced the same issues that Xinjiang has faced. Wherever the problem festered, the sacrifice of human life was much greater. The impact on people's livelihood and economy was much greater. And we need to look at the context of the region to really understand why is it that Xinjiang has succeeded? Why is it that addressing the root causes is so important? And I implore people who are not doubting what's being said about Xinjiang to think about what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya, and so many other countries. We have to doubt this narrative. We have to doubt such narrative that's baseless, especially. So I hope your audience can look into this.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Ahmed with Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.